The scent of wine hung heavy in the air, darker than it should be at 3 in the afternoon. I pressed my palm against the cafe's front window, watching the amber liquid pool beneath overturned bottles, the glass catching fragments of afternoon light that seemed too dim for October. My reflection stared back, hollow cheeks, tired eyes, the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. The cafe felt different today, charged with an electricity that made my skin prickle. Behind me, the espresso machine hissed like something alive, and I caught the faint smell of smoke that shouldn't be there. I turned back to the dining room, wiping my hands on my apron. 3 customers sat scattered across the mismatched tables. An elderly man reading a newspaper that crackled too loudly when he turned the pages. A woman typing frantically on her laptop with fingers that trembled slightly. And in the corner booth, a man in an expensive charcoal coat watching his daughter color in a book. The little girl's dark curls bounced as she worked, her tongue poking out in concentration. Something about the way the man sat, perfectly still, his pale hands folded on the table, made my stomach tighten with unease. The smoke smell grew stronger. "Chloe, table 6 needs their check." My manager, Rosa's voice carried from behind the counter, but when I glanced over, her face had gone white. She was staring at something behind me, her mouth slightly open. I spun around. Orange light flickered against the back wall of the cafe, and the temperature in the room suddenly spiked. The smoke wasn't just a smell anymore. It was visible, creeping along the ceiling like grasping fingers. The electrical outlet near the coffee station sparked, sending a shower of bright fragments across the floor. "Fire!" The word tore from my throat before I could think. The elderly man dropped his newspaper and stumbled toward the exit. The woman with the laptop screamed, knocking over her chair, but the little girl in the corner booth just kept coloring, her small hand moving the crayon in careful circles, while flames began licking at the walls behind her. "Grace, we need to leave now." The man in the charcoal coat stood with fluid grace, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to vibrate in my chest. But Grace didn't look up from her coloring book. "I can't find Mr. Whiskers," she said, her voice small and clear above the growing roar of flames. "I dropped him under the table." The fire spread faster than should be possible, racing across the walls with hungry eagerness. Heat pressed against my back like a living thing. The man, Grace's father, reached for her, but she had already slipped under the table, searching for whatever Mr. Whiskers was. Everyone else was running. Rosa had already disappeared through the front door. The smoke was getting thicker, making my eyes water and my throat burn. But Grace was still under that table, and the flames were moving closer to the corner booth with each passing second. I didn't think. I just moved. My feet carried me across the cafe floor, dodging falling debris and scattered chairs. The heat hit me like a wall when I reached the booth, making my skin feel tight and raw. I dropped to my knees and crawled under the table where Grace sat cross-legged, clutching a small stuffed rabbit to her chest. "Found him," she said brightly, as if we weren't surrounded by fire. "Good job, sweetheart. Now we need to go." I scooped her into my arms, feeling how light she was, how her small hands immediately circled my neck with complete trust. The stuffed rabbit, Mr. Whiskers, pressed between us, soft and worn. Getting out was harder than getting in. The flames had spread across the ceiling, raining sparks and burning fragments. Grace buried her face against my shoulder, her breath warm against my neck. I ran, stumbling over debris, my lungs burning with each breath. The front door seemed impossibly far away, wavering through the smoke like a mirage. Then we were outside, and October air hit my face like a blessing. I set Grace down on the sidewalk, my hands shaking as I checked her for burns. She seemed perfectly fine, still clutching Mr. Whiskers and looking up at me with eyes that were too old for her face, pale gray eyes that seemed to see more than a child should. "Thank you, Chloe." Her voice was soft, formal in a way that made my skin prickle again. I hadn't told her my name. Grace. The man in the charcoal coat materialized beside us, and I realized I hadn't seen him come out of the cafe. He moved like liquid shadow, too smooth, too quiet. When he looked at me, His eyes were the same pale gray as his daughter's, but ancient in a way that made my breath catch. "You saved her." "Anyone would have done the same," I said, but my voice came out hoarse from the smoke. He studied me for a long moment, his gaze intense enough to make me want to step backward. "No," he said quietly. "They wouldn't have." Fire trucks arrived, their sirens wailing. Paramedics swarmed around us, checking Grace and me for smoke, inhalation, and burns. I watched them work, feeling disconnected from everything, like I was floating above the scene. The cafe was already a total loss, flames pouring from every window. When the paramedic finished examining me, the man in the charcoal coat was still there, watching. Grace had been taken to one of the ambulances for a more thorough check, but she kept looking back toward us. "Alexander Reid," he said, extending his hand. His skin was cold despite the heat from the fire, and his grip was stronger than it should be. "I owe you a debt." "Chloe Davis. And you don't owe me anything. I'm just glad she's okay." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. He reached into his coat and pulled out a business card, pressing it into my palm. The paper felt expensive, heavier than normal cardstock. "If you ever need anything," he said, his voice carrying that same strange authority I'd noticed inside. "Anything at all." I looked down at the card. It was black with silver lettering that seemed to shift in the firelight. Just a phone number, no company name or title. When I looked up again, Alexander Reid was walking toward the ambulance where Grace waited, his coat billowing behind him like wings. The next morning, Rosa called me at my tiny studio apartment. I'd been lying in bed, staring at the ceiling and smelling smoke in my hair despite 3 showers. My body ached in places I didn't know could ache, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw flames. "Chloe, I'm sorry, but I have to let you go." The words hit me like cold water. "What?" "Rosa, the fire wasn't my fault." "I know, honey, but people are asking questions. About you. About why you went back for that little girl." Her voice was strained, frightened. "Some very dangerous people are interested in you now, and I can't have that kind of attention on my business. I'm sorry." She hung up before I could respond. I sat on the edge of my bed, holding the phone and trying to process what had just happened. I'd saved a child's life, and now I was unemployed. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so devastating. Over the next 3 days, I applied to every restaurant, cafe, and diner within walking distance of my apartment. The conversations all went the same way. Interested managers who suddenly grew cold when they heard my name, hushed phone calls, apologetic rejections. By the 4th day, I understood. Somehow, saving Grace had made me untouchable in the worst possible way. I was down to my last $20 when the threats started. The first note was slipped under my apartment door, written in spidery handwriting on expensive paper. "The girl should have burned. You made a mistake." The second came the next day. "Pretty little waitresses break so easily." The third was just an address, my address, with a single word: soon. I called the police, but they looked at the notes with bored expressions and told me to be more careful, and maybe stay with friends for a while. They didn't seem to understand that I didn't have friends to stay with, that I'd been living paycheck to paycheck in a city that chewed up people like me and spat them out. On the 7th day after the fire, I came home from another fruitless job search to find my apartment building's front door standing open. Mrs. Chen from 2B was crying on the sidewalk, speaking rapidly in Mandarin to a police officer who looked overwhelmed. Broken glass sparkled on the concrete, and the smell of gas hung heavy in the air. "What happened?" I asked Mrs. Chen, switching to the few words of Mandarin I'd picked up from working in Chinatown. She grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "Bomb!" she said in English, her accent thick with terror. "3rd floor! Your floor!" My apartment was gone. Not just damaged, completely destroyed, along with the 2 apartments next to it. The police officer explained that it had been a gas leak, probably accidental, but his eyes kept shifting away from mine when he talked. Mrs. Chen whispered that she'd seen strange men in expensive suits in the building earlier that morning, men who moved too quietly and left no footprints in the dust. I stood on the sidewalk with everything I owned, my purse, my phone, and the clothes on my back. and finally understood that this wasn't about bad luck or coincidence. Someone wanted me gone, and they were willing to hurt innocent people to make it happen. That's when I remembered the business card. I found it in my wallet, still black with silver lettering that seemed to shimmer under the streetlight. I'd been carrying it for a week without really thinking about why. My fingers shook as I dialed the number. "You've reached the Midnight Marks emergency line." The voice was professional, crisp. "How can we help you?" "This is Chloe Davis. Alexander Reid gave me this number. I think I'm in trouble." A pause. "Miss Davis, we've been expecting your call. A car will be with you in 5 minutes." I looked around at the ruins of my life, the destroyed building, the crying neighbors, the police officers who couldn't meet my eyes. Mrs. Chen was still clutching my arm, and I could smell the fear on her, sharp and acidic. "Okay," I said into the phone, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "I'll be waiting." As I hung up, I realized I was about to step into a world I didn't understand, placing my life in the hands of a man whose pale eyes held secrets I couldn't begin to imagine. But standing there on that sidewalk, with ash in my hair and nowhere left to run, I finally understood that sometimes the only choice left is to... The black sedan pulled up exactly 5 minutes later, so silent I didn't hear it coming until the door opened. The driver wore a dark suit and moved with the same fluid grace I'd noticed in Alexander Reid. He didn't speak, just gestured for me to get in, and I found myself sliding across leather seats that smelled like expensive cologne and something metallic I couldn't identify. The safe house was a cottage nestled in woods I didn't recognize, surrounded by trees that blocked out most of the moonlight. Solar lights marked a winding path to the front door, and when I stepped out of the car, the silence was so complete it made my ears ring. No traffic, no sirens, no city sounds at all. Just the whisper of wind through branches and the distant hoot of an owl. "Miss Davis." Alexander Reid emerged from the shadows by the front door, and I realized he'd been waiting for me. He wore jeans and a dark sweater instead of his expensive coat, but somehow he still looked like he belonged in a boardroom rather than this rustic cottage. "I'm glad you called." I didn't have much choice. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "Someone blew up my building." His jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "The Thin Bloods. They're trying to draw me out by threatening what they think I value." "And what's that?" He looked at me for a long moment, his pale eyes unreadable in the dim light. "You saved my daughter. That makes you precious to me, whether you understand it or not." The cottage interior was warm and inviting, all exposed beams and stone fireplace with flames already crackling behind a metal screen. The furniture looked handmade but expensive, and everything smelled like cedar and wood smoke. Grace sat cross-legged on a thick rug in front of the fire, Mr. Whiskers in her lap and coloring books spread around her like a paper fortress. "Chloe!" She scrambled to her feet and ran to me, her small arms wrapping around my waist with startling strength. "Daddy said you were coming to stay with us. Are you hurt? Did the bad men try to hurt you?" "I'm fine, sweetheart." I smoothed her dark curls, feeling some of the tension leave my shoulders. "How did you know about the bad men?" "Daddy told me. He says they're jealous because he's stronger than they are, so they try to hurt the people we care about instead." She looked up at me with those two old eyes. "But you're safe now. Daddy won't let anything happen to you." Over Grace's head, I met Alexander's gaze. He stood by the fireplace, with his hands clasped behind his back, watching us with an expression I couldn't read. The firelight caught the sharp angles of his face, casting shadows that made him look both beautiful and dangerous. "We need to talk," he said quietly. He led me to the kitchen while Grace returned to her coloring books. The kitchen was modern despite the cottage's rustic exterior, all granite countertops and stainless steel appliances. Alexander moved to the coffee maker with practiced efficiency, his movements precise and economical. "How long have I been marked for death?" I asked, settling onto one of the bar stools. "Since the moment you went back into that cafe." He didn't look at me while he spoke, focused on measuring coffee grounds. "The Thin Bloods have been watching my family for months, looking for weakness. When you saved Grace, you became a weapon they could use against me." because they think I'm important to you. You are important to me. The simple statement sent heat through my chest. Grace hasn't connected with anyone the way she's connected with you. Not since her mother died. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the silence. I watched Alexander's profile, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers gripped the edge of the counter. What aren't you telling me? He turned then, leaning back against the counter with his arms crossed. My world isn't like yours, Chloe. The rules are different. The stakes are higher. Your world? A smile ghosted across his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. Let's just say that the thin bloods in my people have been at war for a very long time. Territory, resources, old grudges that go back generations. They see you as a way to hurt me, and they won't stop until either you're dead or I give them what they want. Which is my daughter, my business interests, my life. He poured coffee into 2 mugs, the dark liquid steaming in the warm kitchen air. None of which I'm willing to give them. I accepted the mug he offered, wrapping my hands around the ceramic warmth. So, what happens now? Now you stay here, where it's safe. Grace starts her tutoring sessions tomorrow. She's been homeschooled since the threats began. And I handle the thin blood problem permanently. Something in his tone made my skin prickle. Handle it how? You don't need to know the details. Yes, I do. I set down my mug harder than necessary, coffee sloshing over the rim. People are getting hurt because of me. Mrs. Chen could have been killed in that explosion. I have a right to know what I've gotten myself into. Alexander studied me for a long moment, and I had the unsettling feeling he was seeing more than I wanted him to see. The thin bloods operate through fear and intimidation. They have connections in city government, police departments, legitimate businesses that they use as fronts. Taking them down requires patience and strategy, not violence. That sounds very civilized. I've learned that sometimes the most effective revenge is watching your enemies destroy themselves. He moved closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something dark and expensive that made my pulse quicken. But it takes time. Weeks, maybe months. And I'm supposed to hide in the woods for months? You're supposed to stay alive. His voice dropped, becoming rougher. Because if something happens to you, Grace will never forgive me. And neither will I. The next 3 weeks fell into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Grace and I developed our own routine, breakfast together while Alexander handled business calls from his home office, then lessons in the morning, and outdoor exploration in the afternoon. She was wickedly smart, reading at a level far beyond her age and asking questions that made me think harder than any college course ever had. Why do people hurt each other? She asked one afternoon as we sat by the small pond behind the cottage, watching ducks paddle in lazy circles. Sometimes because they're scared, I said, tossing breadcrumbs into the water. Sometimes because they don't know how to get what they need without taking it from someone else. Is that why the thin bloods want to hurt you? Because they're scared of Daddy? I glanced at her, noting the casual way she said the name that made grown men nervous. Something like that. Daddy says fear makes people do stupid things. He says that's why we have to be smarter than them. Your daddy is a very wise man. Grace nodded sagely, then brightened as one of the ducks waddled closer, to shore. Do you think they like peanut butter sandwiches? Mr. Whiskers loves peanut butter, but Daddy says rabbits aren't supposed to eat people food. The dangerous conversation was forgotten as we debated duck dietary preferences, but I found myself thinking about what she'd said later that evening. Alexander handled his business with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything else, making calls in languages I didn't recognize, and disappearing for hours at a time, returning with tension radiating from his shoulders and shadows under his eyes. How's it going? I asked one night when he emerged from his office looking particularly grim. Slowly. He rubbed his temples, and I noticed his hands were shaking slightly. The thin bloods have more resources than I anticipated. More connections. Maybe you need help. He looked at me sharply. I told you, this isn't your fight. It became my fight when they blew up my building. I moved closer, studying his face in the lamplight. He looked exhausted, older than when I'd first met him. When was the last time you slept? Really slept? Sleep is a luxury I can't afford right now. Alexander. I reached out without thinking, my fingers brushing the back of his hand. His skin was cold, always cold, but it warmed under my touch. You can't protect us if you collapse from exhaustion. Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the controlled facade he wore like armor. For just a moment I saw the man underneath, tired, worried, carrying the weight of keeping us safe on his shoulders. I can't lose her, Chloe. She's everything I have left. You won't lose her, but you have to trust that you're not alone in this anymore. His fingers turned, intertwining with mine, and the simple contact sent warmth spreading up my arm. When this is over, a sound cut through the night, sharp, metallic, like breaking glass. Alexander's head snapped toward the front of the cottage, his entire body going rigid with alertness. Get Grace, now. I didn't argue. I ran to Grace's room, finding her sitting up in bed with Mr. Whiskers clutched to her chest and her eyes wide with fear. I heard it too, she whispered. We need to go to the safe room, sweetheart. I scooped her into my arms, feeling how she trembled despite trying to be brave. Remember what your daddy taught us? She nodded against my shoulder as I carried her to the hidden door behind the bookshelf in Alexander's office. The safe room was small but well stocked, with communications equipment and enough supplies to last for days. Alexander had shown it to us our first week here, hoping we'd never need to use it. He was waiting for us in the office, a gun in his hands that he handled with practiced ease. Lock the door behind you. Don't come out until I give you the all-clear signal. What's happening? I asked, but he was already moving toward the front of the house, silent as a shadow. Grace and I huddled in, the safe room, listening to footsteps above us and voices I couldn't make out. Grace buried her face against my neck, her breath coming in quick, frightened puffs. I stroked her hair and whispered reassurances I wasn't sure I believed, my heart hammering against my ribs. The footsteps moved through the house methodically, living room, kitchen, bedrooms, searching. I counted at least 3 different sets of feet, maybe more. Then silence stretched so long I began to wonder if something had happened to Alexander. A gunshot cracked through the quiet, then another. Grace flinched in my arms, and I pressed my lips to her hair, breathing in her little girl scent of strawberry shampoo and innocence. Chloe Davis. The voice came from directly above us, muffled by the floorboards, but clear enough to understand. We know you're here. Come out now, and the child doesn't get hurt. Grace lifted her head to look at me, her pale gray eyes steady despite her fear. Don't go, she whispered. Daddy will come back. But what if he didn't? What if Alexander was already dead, and these men were going to tear the house apart looking for us? What if staying hidden meant Grace got hurt? We're not just going to wait, another voice said, this one closer to the bookshelf. Start breaking things. She'll come out when the kid starts crying. The sound of shattering glass came from above us, followed by what sounded like furniture being overturned. Grace whimpered, pressing closer to me, and I felt something fierce and protective rise in my chest. These men had already destroyed my life once. I wouldn't let them hurt this little girl. I was reaching for the door handle when the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a second later, casting everything in red shadows. Through the communications equipment, I could hear voices upstairs becoming confused, then angry. Heavy footsteps moved in different directions, no longer methodical, but hurried, nervous. Where the hell did he go? Check the back rooms again. Something's not right. We should get out of here. A scream cut through the voices, high and terrified, then abruptly cut off. Grace grabbed my hand, her small fingers squeezing tight. Daddy, she whispered. Another scream from a different throat. Then silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. The all-clear signal came 20 minutes later. 3 knocks. Pause. 2 knocks. Pause. 1 knock. I opened the safe room door with shaking hands to find Alexander waiting in his office. His clothes were torn, and there was blood on his hands, but his eyes were clear and calm. "It's over," he said simply. Grace launched herself into his arms, and he caught her easily, holding her tight while she sobbed against his shoulder. Over her head, his eyes met mine, and I saw something in them I hadn't seen before. A darkness that made my skin prickle with awareness of just how dangerous this man really was. "How many?" I asked quietly. "4. They won't be reporting back to their bosses." He carried Grace to the couch, settling her on his lap while she clung to his shirt. "I'm sorry you had to go through that, both of you." "Are more coming?" "Not tonight, but this was just a scouting party. The real assault will come later, when they realize these men aren't coming back." He looked down at Grace, who had finally stopped crying, but still had her arms wrapped around his neck. "We need to move to a more secure location." "Where?" "Somewhere the Thin Bloods can't follow. Somewhere they don't have connections or resources." His pale eyes found mine again. "But first, I need to tell you what you've really gotten yourself into. What I really am." Grace lifted her head from his shoulder, looking between us with those two old eyes. "Are you going to tell her about the family business, Daddy?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "Yes, sweetheart. I think it's time." He carried Grace to her room first, tucking her into bed with Mr. Whiskers and singing her a lullaby in what sounded like Italian. I waited in the living room, staring into the dying fire and trying to process what had just happened. 4 men had come here to kill me, and now they were dead. Alexander had handled them alone, in the dark, with an efficiency that suggested this wasn't his first time. When he returned, he poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey from a bottle I hadn't seen before, and settled into the chair across from me. The firelight caught the planes of his face, making him look like something carved from marble. "The Reid family has been in the wine business for over 300 years, he began, his voice carefully neutral. "We own vineyards, distribution networks, restaurants and tasting rooms across the country. Completely legitimate, very profitable. But that's not all you do. No." He took a sip of whiskey, and I caught the flash of something sharp against his lower lip in the firelight. "We also provide certain services to people who need problems solved discreetly. Protection, information, occasionally more permanent solutions. You're criminals. We're survivors." His tone remained calm, but I heard steel underneath. "The Thin Bloods are our primary competition. They deal in drugs, human trafficking, the kinds of businesses that destroy lives. We've been trying to push them out of our territory for decades, and now I'm caught in the middle of a gang war. Now you're under my protection, which means you're family, and my family doesn't get hurt by parasites like the Thin Bloods." He leaned forward, his pale eyes intense. "I'm going to end this, Chloe. Permanently. But I need you to trust me." I stared at him, this man who had materialized out of shadows to save his daughter, who had given me shelter when I had nowhere else to go, who had just killed 4 people to keep Grace and me safe. "What are you going to do?" "The Thin Bloods have spent years building their network through corruption and fear. Politicians, judges, police commanders, they all owe favors or take bribes. But corruption works both ways." His smile was sharp as a blade. "I'm going to give the federal authorities everything they need to bring down the entire organization. Names, dates, financial records, locations of bodies they think will never be found. You have all that? I've been collecting it for years, insurance originally, but now it's going to be their destruction." He finished his whiskey and set the glass down with careful precision. "Within a month, there won't be a Thin Blood left on the streets. The ones that don't get arrested will run, and the ones that don't run will wish they had." The certainty in his voice sent a chill down my spine. "And after that?" "After that, you're free to go back to your life. I'll make sure you have enough money to start over anywhere you want, a new identity if you need it. You saved Grace, and I pay my debts." I should have felt relieved. The nightmare would be over, and I could go back to being invisible, unremarkable Chloe Davis. But sitting there in the firelight, looking at this dangerous, complicated man who had risked everything to protect me. I realized I didn't want to go back to being invisible. What if I don't want to go back to my old life? Alexander went very still, his pale eyes searching my face. What are you saying? I'm saying that for the first time in my adult life, I feel like I belong somewhere. Grace needs me, and I stopped, not sure how to put into words the connection I felt to both of them. I don't want to lose this. Lose her. Lose you. He stood slowly, moving to the window that looked out over the dark woods. My world is dangerous, Chloe. What happened tonight is just the beginning of what my enemies will try to do to people I care about. Then we make sure they can't hurt us. He turned back to me, something vulnerable flickering across his features. You don't understand what you're asking for. I understand that I've never felt safer than I do right here, with you and Grace. I understand that she looks at me like I hung the moon, and you look at me like I'm worth protecting. I stood too, moving closer until I could see the flecks of silver in his pale eyes. I understand that I'm falling in love with both of you, and I don't want to walk away from the only family I've ever had. Alexander reached out, his cold fingers tracing the line of my jaw. If you stay, there's no going back. The Reid family doesn't let people leave once they're truly in. Good, I whispered, because I'm not going anywhere. He kissed me then, his lips cold at first, but warming under mine. He tasted like whiskey and danger, and promises I wasn't sure he could keep. When we broke apart, his forehead rested against mine, and I could feel some of the tension leaving his shoulders. The next few weeks are going to be difficult, he murmured. I'll need to be away more often, tying up loose ends and making sure the authorities have everything they need. Can you handle taking care of Grace on your own? We'll take care of each other. And after it's over, when the thin bloods are gone and you're truly safe, we'll talk about what comes next. What you want, what kind of life you want to build. I thought about my tiny studio apartment, my endless cycle of dead-end jobs, the loneliness that had been my constant companion for so long. I want to build something that matters, something that lasts. Then we'll build it together. A month later, I stood in the kitchen of our new house, not a safe house this time, but a real home with Grace's artwork on the refrigerator and photos of the three of us on the mantel. Alexander had been right about the thin bloods. The arrests had started 2 weeks ago and were still ongoing, a carefully orchestrated takedown that had made national news. The few members who hadn't been caught had fled the city entirely. Grace was at the kitchen table doing homework, her tongue sticking out in concentration, the same way it had that first day in the cafe. Alexander sat across from her, helping with math problems and stealing glances at me as I prepared dinner. Chloe, Grace said suddenly, looking up from her worksheets. Daddy says you used to work in a restaurant. That's right, sweetheart. Did you like it? I considered the question, thinking about the endless shifts and rude customers and paychecks that never stretched far enough. I liked parts of it. I liked taking care of people, making sure they had what they needed. What did you want to do? Before everything happened? Alexander looked up from the math problems, his pale eyes curious. We'd talked about the future in general terms, but I'd never told him about the dream I'd carried for years, the one that seemed impossible when I was barely surviving paycheck to paycheck. I wanted to open a wine tasting room, I said, the words coming easier than I'd expected. Somewhere people could come to learn about different wines, maybe with antique collections and stories about the vineyards. A place that felt warm and welcoming, where people could discover something new. Grace's face lit up. Like a museum? But with wine? Something like that. Alexander had gone very quiet, his fingers steepled under his chin as he watched me. You never mentioned this before. It was just a dream. I never had the money or the connections to make it real. What if you did? He asked softly. What if you had everything you needed to make it happen? I looked at him, seeing something intense brewing in his pale eyes. Alexander, I mean it. The Reid Family Foundation has been looking for new projects to support, legitimate businesses that contribute to the community. He leaned forward, his voice gaining strength. You could have your wine tasting. Room, Chloe. We could make it happen. I couldn't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering. He stood, moving around the table to take my hands in his cold ones. You saved my daughter's life. You stayed when any reasonable person would have run. You chose us when you could have chosen safety. His thumbs brushed across my knuckles. Let me give you this. Let me help you build something that's truly yours. I looked down at Grace, who was watching us with bright, hopeful eyes. What do you think, sweetheart? Should we open a wine tasting room? Can I help pick out the decorations? Of course. And can we have a section for kids who don't drink wine yet, with grape juice and fancy glasses? Alexander laughed, the sound rich and warm in our kitchen. I think that's an excellent idea. 3 months after that, I stood in the doorway of Davis Wine Sanctuary, watching the last contractor pack up his tools. The space was everything I'd dreamed of. Exposed brick walls lined with carefully curated wine collections, comfortable seating areas that invited lingering conversations, and yes, a corner section with child-sized tables and grape juice served in small wine glasses for younger visitors. Grace had insisted on the name. It sounds like somewhere people go to feel safe, she'd explained, and I couldn't argue with that logic. Alexander appeared beside me, slipping his arm around my waist as we surveyed our work. Ready for tomorrow? Tomorrow was the grand opening. We'd sent invitations to local food critics, wine enthusiasts, and community leaders. The Reid family's reputation had opened doors. I never could have opened myself, but the vision, the execution, the heart of the place, that was all mine. I think so, I said, leaning into his solid warmth. Are you sure about this? Once we open, there's no hiding what we mean to each other. Good, he said, echoing my words from that night by the fire. I'm tired of hiding. Grace came running from the back office, her arms full of the special programs we'd printed for opening night. Look, they turned out perfect. She was right. The programs were elegant and professional, featuring photos of the space and information about our featured wines. At the bottom, in small print, it listed the Davis Wine Sanctuary as a project supported by the Reid Family Foundation. I have something for you, Alexander said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small velvet box, and my heart stopped. Before you panic, it's not what you think. Not yet. Inside the box was a key, old-fashioned and ornate, made of what looked like silver. It's the key to the front door, he explained. Your key, because this place is yours, Chloe. Whatever happens between us, whatever the future holds, this sanctuary belongs to you. I took the key with shaking fingers, feeling the weight of it, the promise it represented. Alexander? And when you're ready, he continued, his pale eyes serious. When you're sure this is what you want, there will be another key. To our home, to our life together. But only when you're ready. Grace bounced on her toes beside us. Does this mean we're really going to be a family? Like, forever and ever? I looked at this little girl who had changed my life by needing to be saved, at this dangerous, complicated man who had protected us both and given me the chance to build something lasting. A year ago, I'd been invisible, struggling to survive in a city that didn't care if I lived or died. Now I stood in my own business, surrounded by people who loved me, holding the key to a future I'd never dared imagine. Yes, sweetheart, I said, pulling Grace into a hug while Alexander's arm tightened around us both. Forever and ever. Outside I could hear cars pulling into the parking lot, our first customers arriving for tomorrow's soft opening, friends and family coming to see what we'd built together. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting warm gold light across the exposed brick and polished wood floors. I looked around the sanctuary one more time, taking in every detail. The carefully arranged wine displays, the comfortable seating areas, the corner where Grace would hold court with her grape juice in grown-up glasses. It was exactly what I'd envisioned, but better, because it was real, because it was mine, because I'd built it with the help of people who believed in me. Ready? Alexander asked, his hand finding mine. I squeezed his fingers, feeling the solid warmth of him, the promise of everything we were building together. Through the windows, I could see Grace on the front porch, greeting our guests with the confidence of someone who knew she was loved and protected. This was my sanctuary, my family, my future. And The first visitors were already walking through the door when the explosion shattered the evening calm. Glass rained down from the storefront windows as a car bomb detonated in the parking lot, the shockwave throwing me against the wine display and sending bottles crashing to the floor. My ears rang as I pushed myself up, tasting blood and dust. "Grace!" Alexander's voice cut through the chaos, and I saw him hauling our daughter away from the front windows, shielding her body with his own as debris scattered across the polished floors. She was crying, clutching Mr. Whiskers, but she was moving, alive, and whole. Through the smoke and shattered glass, I could see figures approaching the building. 4 of them, moving with military precision despite the destruction they'd just caused. The Thin Bloods weren't as finished as we'd thought. "Back exit," Alexander commanded, his pale eyes hard as winter ice. But when I tried to stand, my left leg buckled beneath me. Blood soaked through my jeans where glass had sliced deep into my thigh. "I can't," I started, but he was already there, lifting me with one arm while Grace clung to his neck with the other. "The wine cellar," I gasped, remembering the reinforced door Alexander had insisted on during construction. "There's a storage room with steel walls." He carried us through the wreckage of our sanctuary, past overturned tables and wine-soaked floors, past the dreams we'd spent months building together. The cellar door was heavy and German-made, designed to protect vintage wines from temperature fluctuations. Now it might protect us from bullets. The storage room was small and windowless, filled with cases of wine that hadn't yet made it to the display area. Alexander set Grace down gently, then turned to examine my leg in the dim overhead light. His fingers were gentle but professional as he probed the wound, and I bit back a cry as he pressed a clean cloth against the worst of the bleeding. "It's not arterial," he said quietly. "You'll be fine if we can get you to a hospital." "Daddy, I'm scared," Grace whispered, her small voice echoing off the concrete walls. "I know, sweetheart." He pulled out his phone, fingers flying over the screen. "But remember what we practiced? Sometimes bad things happen, but that's when we show how brave we really are." Footsteps echoed from the main floor above us, heavy boots moving systematically through the building. They were searching, and it was only a matter of time before they found the cellar door. "How many men do you have nearby?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady despite the pain radiating up my leg. "None close enough." Alexander's jaw tightened as he typed another message. "I sent most of my people to handle the federal raids. I thought the threat was over." A crash came from overhead, followed by the sound of splintering wood. They were tearing the place apart, looking for us. I thought of the wine displays we'd arranged so carefully, the comfortable seating areas where people were supposed to discover new favorites and make memories. All of it destroyed because of me. "This is my fault," I whispered. "If I hadn't insisted on opening—" "Stop!" Alexander's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "This is the Thin Blood's fault. No one else's." Grace had gone very quiet, pressed against the wall with Mr. Whiskers clutched to her chest. Her pale gray eyes moved between us, too old and too knowing for a 7-year-old. "Are we going to die, Daddy?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Alexander looked at his daughter for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his response. Truth versus comfort, honesty versus hope. "Not if I can help it," he said finally, and something in his voice made my skin prickle with awareness of just how dangerous this man could be when protecting what he loved. The footsteps above us had stopped. Then I heard the distinctive creak of the cellar door opening. Alexander positioned himself between us and the storage room entrance, a gun appearing in his hand with fluid grace. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "stay behind me, both of you." The first man down the cellar stairs wore all black and moved like a predator. Alexander put 2 bullets in his chest before he reached the bottom step, the shots echoing off the concrete walls like thunder. Grace flinched but didn't cry out, pressing her face against my shoulder as I held her tight despite the fire in my wounded leg. The second man was smarter, staying on the stairs and firing blind around the corner. Bullets sparked off the steel wine racks, sending shards of metal ricocheting through the cellar air. Alexander returned fire with calculated precision, each shot placed exactly where it needed to be. "Chloe Davis!" The voice came from the top of the stairs, and I recognized it from the safe house attack. "Come out now, and the kid lives. Keep hiding, and we burn this whole building down with all of you in it." I started to stand, ready to trade myself for Grace's safety, but Alexander's hand clamped down on my shoulder. "Don't even think about it," he growled. "They want me, not her. They want to hurt me, and killing you is the most effective way to do it. Giving yourself up won't save Grace. It'll just guarantee that I have to watch you die before they kill her anyway." The truth of it hit me like ice water. These weren't rational people looking for a fair trade. They were animals backed into a corner, lashing out at anything they could reach, and we were trapped with them. 60 seconds, the voice called down. "Then we start with gasoline." Alexander's phone buzzed against his pocket. He glanced at the screen, and for the first time since the explosion, I saw hope flicker in his pale eyes. "Marco's 3 blocks out with a full team. We just need to hold them for another few minutes." But minutes felt like hours, when every second brought the smell of gasoline drifting down the stairs. They weren't bluffing about burning us out. I could hear them moving around upstairs, probably dousing the main floor with accelerant. "Daddy," Grace whispered, her small hand finding his free one. "I love you. I love you too, sweetheart. Both of you." His eyes found mine over her head, and in them I saw everything we'd never had the chance to say to each other. All the mornings we wouldn't share, all the dreams we wouldn't build together. That's when I understood what I had to do. The wine cellar had been built with a ventilation system that connected to an exterior wall. The grate was small, barely large enough for a child, but it led directly outside. If Grace could reach it, if she could get through... "Alexander," I said quietly, nodding toward the ventilation shaft. "Grace could fit." He followed my gaze, and I saw him run the calculations. The shaft, the distance, the time it would take. She's never done anything like that alone. She won't be alone. I looked down at Grace, smoothing her dark curls away from her face. "Remember the adventure stories we read? About brave princesses who had to be clever to save everyone?" Grace nodded, her gray eyes brightening with understanding. "This is your adventure, sweetheart. You're going to crawl through that tunnel and find the good guys outside. Can you do that for us?" "What about you and Daddy?" "We'll be right behind you," I lied, knowing that Alexander and I needed to stay and buy her time, needed to make sure the Thin Bloods didn't realize she was escaping until it was too late. Alexander was already moving, using the butt of his gun to knock out the ventilation grate. The opening was barely 2 feet square, a tight fit even for Grace. "Straight out, then turn left toward the street," he instructed, lifting her toward the opening. "Run to the first police car you see and tell them your daddy sent you." "I don't want to leave you," she said, her small hands gripping his shirt. "I know, but this is how you save us, Grace. This is how you be brave." She nodded, squared her small shoulders, and crawled into the shaft with Mr. Whiskers tucked under one arm. I listened to the sound of her moving through the tunnel, counting seconds and praying she would make it outside before the Thin Bloods lost patience. The smell of gasoline was getting stronger. They were getting ready to light the place up. 15 more seconds, I whispered to Alexander, checking my phone's timer. "Chloe." His voice was rough, urgent. "If we don't make it out of this, we will. But if we don't, I need you to know that these months with you have been the best of my life. You saved my daughter, and then you saved me." I reached for his hand, intertwining our fingers. "You gave me everything I never knew I wanted. A family, a purpose, a home." The sound of sirens cut through the night air, growing closer. Grace had made it. She was safe. Above us, I could hear confusion in the Thin Bloods' voices. They'd heard the sirens too, and they were running out of time. Which made them desperate, which made them dangerous. "Time's up!" The voice from upstairs was panicked now. "Light it up!" The first flicker of flame appeared at the top of the cellar stairs, orange light dancing against the concrete walls. Smoke began to drift down, acrid and thick. Alexander pulled me deeper into the storage room, pressing damp cloths over our faces as the fire began to spread. But the sirens were getting louder, and I could hear shouting from outside the building. Marco and his team had arrived, and they weren't here for a quiet conversation. Gunfire erupted from the main floor. Not the careful, precise shots Alexander favored, but the wild spray of automatic weapons. The Thin Bloods were making their last stand, and from the sound of it, they were outnumbered. "Stay low," Alexander commanded, pulling me toward the cellar stairs. The fire had spread across the ceiling, but hadn't yet blocked our exit route. "We're going up." "Are you insane?" My wounded leg screamed as he hauled me to my feet. "They're shooting up there." "And down here, we burn to death. I'll take bullets over fire." He was right. The smoke was getting thicker, making it hard to breathe even with the damp cloths. We had maybe 2 minutes before the cellar became a death trap. Alexander went first, gun ready, moving up the stairs with the fluid grace of a predator. I followed as quickly as my injured leg would allow, using the wall for support and trying not to think about the blood I was leaving behind. The main floor of the sanctuary was a war zone. Tables were overturned, wine bottles shattered, and flames licked at the ceiling beams. Through the smoke, I could see muzzle flashes as the remaining Thin Bloods fought Marco's team from behind the bar. "Kitchen," Alexander said, pointing toward the back of the building. "There's an exit that leads to the alley." We moved along the wall, staying low, using the smoke and chaos for cover. My leg was on fire, but Alexander's arm around my waist kept me upright, kept me moving toward safety. We were 10 feet from the kitchen door when one of the Thin Bloods spotted us. He turned his weapon toward us, finger tightening on the trigger, and I knew we weren't going to make it. The shot came from behind us, Marco's rifle, precise and deadly. The Thin Blood dropped without firing a round, and Marco appeared through the smoke like an avenging angel in an expensive suit. "Boss! This way!" He led us through the kitchen and out into the alley, where paramedics were already waiting. The cool night air hit my lungs like salvation, clean and sweet after the smoke and flames. I collapsed onto a stretcher, letting the medics take over, letting myself finally believe we were safe. Grace was there, wrapped in a blanket and clutching a female police officer's hand. When she saw us, she broke free and ran to Alexander, throwing her small arms around him with enough force to nearly knock him over. "I did it, Daddy! I was brave like you taught me." "You were perfect, sweetheart. So brave and so smart." He held her tight, his pale eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'm so proud of you." Over Grace's head, I watched the sanctuary burn. 6 months of work, all our dreams and plans reduced to smoke and ash. The Thin Bloods had taken everything from me again, but this time, they hadn't taken what mattered most. "We'll rebuild," Alexander said quietly, following my gaze to the burning building. "Bigger and better. Somewhere safer." "No." The word came out stronger than I felt, but I meant it. "We'll build something new, something different." He looked at me questioningly, and I tried to find the words for what I was feeling. The sanctuary had been my dream, but dreams could change. Dreams could grow. "I wanted a place where people could feel safe and welcomed," I said, watching flames consume the exposed brick walls we'd worked so hard to preserve. "But maybe it doesn't have to be about wine. Maybe it can be about something bigger." Grace looked between us, her gray eyes bright with curiosity. "Like what?" I thought about the past 6 months, about the journey that had brought us together, about finding family in the most unexpected places, about discovering courage I didn't know I had, about learning that sometimes the best things in life came from the ashes of the worst. "Like hope," I said finally. "A place where people who have lost everything can come to start over, where families can heal and grow stronger." Alexander's smile was soft and proud. The Reid Family Foundation could fund something like that. A community center, maybe, with programs for kids and families, support for people trying to rebuild their lives. And wine tasting on Friday nights, Grace added solemnly, because people still need to celebrate good things. I laughed despite everything, despite the pain in my leg and the smoke in my lungs and the ruins of our sanctuary still burning behind us. And grape juice for kids who don't drink wine yet. In fancy glasses, Grace insisted. In fancy glasses. 3 months later, I stood in the doorway of the Hope Community Center, watching contractors put the finishing touches on what would become our new sanctuary. The space was larger than the wine tasting room had been, with areas designed for children's programs, family counseling, job training, and yes, a small section for wine education and tasting events. The Reid Family Foundation had purchased the building outright, but the vision, the programs, the heart of the place, that was all ours. Mine and Alexander's and Grace's, built together from the ashes of what we'd lost. Ready for tomorrow? Alexander asked, slipping his arms around me from behind. Tomorrow was our grand opening. We'd invited social workers, family counselors, community leaders, and the families we'd already begun working with. The mayor was coming to cut the ribbon, and local news stations were planning to cover the event. I think so, I said, leaning back against his solid warmth. Are you sure about this? About all of it? About building something that helps people? About creating a legacy that Grace can be proud of? He turned me in his arms, his pale eyes serious. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Grace came running from the children's area, her arms full of art supplies, and her face bright with excitement. Chloe, look what Miss Sarah taught me to make. She held up a drawing of 3 stick figures standing in front of a building. Above them, in careful 7-year-old handwriting, she'd written, "My family." It's beautiful, sweetheart, I said, kneeling down to examine her artwork more closely. Is this our new place? Uh-huh. And that's you and Daddy and me? We're taking care of people, just like you took care of me in the fire. I looked at this little girl who had changed my life by needing to be saved, at this dangerous, complicated man who had protected us both and given me the chance to build something lasting. A year ago, I'd been invisible, struggling to survive in a city that didn't care if I lived or died. Now I stood in a building that would bear my name, surrounded by people who loved me, ready to spend my life helping others find their way home. Alexander reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small velvet box that made my heart skip. I know I said I'd wait until you were ready, he said, his voice rough with emotion. But watching you rebuild from the ashes, seeing you turn our tragedy into hope for other people, I can't wait anymore, Chloe. I don't want to wait anymore. Inside the box was a ring, not flashy or ostentatious, but elegant and timeless, with a diamond that caught the afternoon light streaming through our new windows. Will you marry me? Will you be my wife, Grace's mother, and my partner in everything we build together? Grace bounced on her toes beside us. Say yes, Chloe. Please say yes. I looked around the community center one more time, taking in every detail. The comfortable seating areas where families would learn to heal together, the children's space where kids like Grace would discover they were safe and loved, the small wine-tasting corner where people would celebrate life's good moments. This was my sanctuary, my family, my future. And I was exactly where I belonged. Yes, I whispered, and then louder, strong enough for the whole world to hear. Yes, Alexander. Yes to all of it. He slipped the ring onto my finger with hands that shook slightly, and Grace whooped with joy, spinning in circles with her arms spread wide. Through the windows, I could see the city stretching out around us, full of people who needed hope, who needed second chances, who needed to know that family could be found in the most unexpected places. Tomorrow we would open our doors and begin the work of helping others rebuild their lives. But today, in this moment, surrounded by the people who had saved me and the dreams we were building together, I was home. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting warm gold light across the polished floors and freshly painted walls. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear children playing in the park across the street, their laughter carrying on the spring breeze. Alexander's arms tightened around me as Grace settled against my side, and I breathed in the scent of new beginnings, fresh paint and possibility, love and hope, and the promise of everything we were going to build together. This was my sanctuary, my family, my forever, and it was perfect.